go around the room and identify ourselves for the record. We'll start with you, Mr. Peterson.
Pete Peterson.
Christopher Constant.
Dick Training.
Forrest Dunbar.
Felix Rivera.
Don Weddleton.
Team Diggs.
I'll go ahead.
Alan Kennedy, Chair of the Budget Advisory Commission.
Mr. Falsey's joined us. How are you doing, sir?
Municipal Manager.
Okay.
We're not going to go around the whole.
No, I'm not going to run everything. Too many people. And the mayor's here. So, who's coming down to present? I think Suzanne LaFrancis on and Amy Dabowski may be online too.
So Rebecca Pearson, municipal attorney, is on her way with the presentation. We've got a little word. There were more people than we were anticipating, so we're printing more copies.
Mr. Foles, I see we just got passed out 2018-1. I've been told that the IBW has been given the S version of this. Are you planning on giving the S version to the administration?
We are planning on giving you the S version that I don't believe IBW has. The IBW got some changes that we have proposed to roll into an S version, and that's the full story that we're going to give you today. And
But
so
we will
while-
get an S version, sir?
What is that?
We'll get an S version?
Yes. The S
Thank you.
version is right here.
Arriving as we speak.
Oops, excuse me, wrong button.
Do you need an hour for it?
I don't think so, but the presentation guys in the middle.
So we're just passing this out. No need to work through it in real time. It's part of the presentation now. So we're going to step you through it piece by piece. So we appreciate everyone's coming today and all the interest. We unveiled this proposed transaction last December, and then we have started this big community conversation. We are hoping in today's presentation to further the process by showing you what this looks like and how it goes to voters in April. The main purpose of today's work session, we hope, was to give you a sense of the ordinance that we put on the Assembly agenda at the last Assembly meeting for introduction and possible action on the 23rd. So as we put that ordinance out into the public domain, we got a lot of questions. Some were just questions about the transaction generally. Some were very specific questions about what was in the language and what was not in the language. Questions came from Assembly members, from constituents, some of our own employees. Some of those were very helpful questions that, as you'll see, have motivated proposed changes to the S version that we would intend to introduce for action at the next Assembly meeting. And if there are further questions that we can help address, that might roll into this before we even introduce this particular version of the S version, so that we have one substitute version for all of your. That said, I'm going to turn it over to our municipal attorney to walk you through AO 2018-1.
Thank you, Mr. Policy, sir. Mr. Policy noted that my agenda here today, my goal is to walk you through 2018-1, what the ordinance does, what the ballot composition it proposes to send to voters would do, how it interacts with the current provisions of the charter, which would govern a sale of any utility. And then, as Mr. Policy noted, we've received questions. I've received some questions, the administration's received some questions, both questions generated by this body and questions generated by constituents that were forwarded on to us, and we wanted to make sure to affirmatively respond to all those questions in this public location so everyone can hear those answers. We have a few experts teed up to be able to respond to some of your specific questions, and we'll get to that at the end of the review. I'll also, in the process, go through the S version, which you all should now have in front of you, which includes some language tweaks and some more substantive changes, which we think are real improvements that hopefully this body will be happy to see. So, in the beginning, 2018-1, what does the ordinance do? Effectively, the ordinance proposes to send to voters a new charter provision, which would create a brand new option for voters to weigh in on a specific contemplated sale of MLP to Chugach Electric in the coming year. So how does this change what's presently in the charter? The charter currently has one specific option provides for one option for the sale of any public utility. All sales are to be by approval, first approved by voters, the question of whether or not a sale can occur by a 3/5 vote. And then once that yay or nay decision comes in, then the authority essentially shifts to the assembly to decide a path forward. The sale has to be to the highest responsive bid, but what constitutes the highest responsive bid, what factors are weighed, how the decision is made is set by the Assembly via ordinance. And so essentially the power comes back to the Assembly to decide what are we looking for, what are the terms we want to look for, and how are we going to weigh the responses we get, and then who are we going to sell it to. So what are we proposing, what happens to the proceeds under the current charter? The charter is also very specific about how the proceeds of any sale are to be treated. First, proceeds are to be used to retire the debt of the utility that's being sold. Second, the proceeds go to retire any other municipal debt deemed appropriate, again, by this body. And then third, the funds would go to establish a trust fund. At this point, that trust fund already exists because the municipality sold ATU previously. So in this instance, proceeds would go to further fund that trust. So what does 1801, what would that look like on the ballot? You get something like this. This is the ballot proposition that was approved when ATU was sold. And basically what you have here is a quick summary of the 1602, kind of what 1602 provides. Then you get a quick summary of 1311, how that disposes of the proceeds. And then this is the sole question that goes to the voters, really, which is, shall the municipality of Anchorage be permitted to sell the utility? What we're actually proposing to do right now is to send significantly more things to the voters for their approval, for them to have the chance to weigh in. The ballot proposition that 2018-01 we proposed to send to voters allows them to weigh in on several of the very key terms of the deal and to say yay or nay to this specific deal. The deal that goes to the voters under 1801 specifies the buyer, says the sale would only be to Chugach Electric Inc., not to any other party. Also specifies the timing. So you'll see in the S version limits the window for approval of a possible sale to the year 2018. It's not an open carte blanche approval for the Assembly to sell the utility at any time. It's a time-limited approval for this, again, for this specific deal. Also specifies the price that the utility could anticipate, or that the municipality can anticipate receiving as part of the deal that goes to voters for approval. Very importantly, it specifies how the proceeds will be used. And it makes one very important change to current charter language, and that is that it specifies that a portion of any annual payments made by Chugach Electric could be used by the municipality to replace current payments in lieu of tax made by ML&P, and thus guarantee to the voters that because those proceeds come in under the tax cap, other taxes, including property taxes, which are subject to the cap, cannot go up as a result of this sale. It doesn't create a gap under the tax cap where what the taxes could suddenly increase. And that's very important because that's not provided for under current charter. So it specifies that that change would be part of this. It also sends a provision to voters about retention of current employees, says that the deal that would be approved would only be a deal that would retain both ML&P and Chugach employees. As we talk about the S version, we'll see that there's an important change there too, that sweeps both employees with both utilities into that protection. And finally, it states that any deal that would be approved must specify no increase in base rates as a result of the transaction. Again, there have been some important changes to the S version at this point as well that we'll talk about in a moment. So specifically, looking at the language of the ballot proposition itself, where are these various terms in the language of the ballot proposition? And I apologize, this is the S version, so it's a little bit messy, but I wanted to work off of what we all have in front of us today. So up top here specifies that this is a sale to Chugach Electric Inc., and that it would have to be approved no later than December 31st, 2018. Here we have the specification that Chugach must pay a competitive value of approximately $1 billion for the purchase. Here in the middle, we have the explanation of the use of the proceeds, and that all-important number 2 that states that a portion of the proceeds may replace ML&P's current payments in lieu of tax to ensure that property and other taxes subject to the cap cannot rise as a result of the sale. Down here, we have the new language regarding intention of employees, a commitment by Chugach Electric not to lay off any ML&P or Chugach Electric employees as a result of the transaction. And finally, here at the end, a commitment to no increase in the base rates.
Mr. Dyson has a question for you, ma'am. Mr. Dyson?
So why do Why do we have to have in this that Chugach won't lay off any employees?
That is an agreement at this point as part of the transaction, and is a term that we've been seeking since the beginning in this negotiation.
So, okay, go ahead.
Mr.
But part of the responsibility that I think we have in the municipality is to make sure that we're not going to lay off people as a result of this transaction, whether they're Chugach employees or whether they're ML&P employees. And it's important to notice that we've deleted the time restriction here, so there is no limit on when that prohibition would occur. But
I get it, but we don't have a responsibility to take care of any non-government entity. It's a good thing for us to think about it.
I've always enjoyed our philosophical battles.
Or the principle, yeah, so.
Is that all, sir?
It's not a bad thing to do, but seems to me part of the sales package of convincing the voters, but not necessary. I
Mr.
don't-
Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, yeah, the eliminating of the 2-year period, I'm wondering just, so there's, you say that since we don't say there's 2 years, that there's never going to be any attrition? Or, that's not realistic.
Well, I think that's a question that could be more specifically responded to by Chugach, but my understanding is the language is exactly as it appears on its face. There will be no layoffs as a result of this transaction. There's no guarantees about anything else that happens in the world, but specifically as a result of this transaction, there will be no layoffs.
And, Mr. Chair, that
Go ahead,
what
sir.
I think we have discussed with Chugach throughout this process is that there is the possibility of reduction in staff through attrition. And that's how they intend to actually reduce staff over time, is through attrition and not layoffs.
That's what they said a couple weeks ago when we met with them first, was through attrition,
Yes.
so.
One follow-up.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, in some situations where one company buys another one out, packages are offered to employees to give them an incentive to retire earlier. Is there any consideration of something like this in this particular deal?
At this point, I don't have anything I can say responsive to that. I don't know, perhaps.
I think that this agreement does not preclude them from doing that. It says they won't lay them off. It says they will reduce employees through attrition. They could offer early retirement packages to employees, and employees would have the opportunity of whether or not to accept those as a way to, I guess, increase the attrition.
Mr. Peterson, anything else?
No, that's good, thanks.
Mr. Wilton, sir?
I got a question, but I think a comment. It does, I don't believe it says here anything about it reducing through attrition. That's not in here. That would be what happens.
Through the chair, Mr. Weddleton, you are correct that it does not say that. What it says is they cannot lay off employees. What Chugach has said throughout our negotiations, as well as public statements, is that their intent is to reduce staff over time through attrition.
So just to beat on this a little bit more, I mean, there will be efficiencies when they combine. So like you've got Unit 1 that you're keeping mothballed in case something happened to Unit 2, but Chugach Electric probably doesn't need that. So they shut that down, and whoever is there working is that. Would they be laid off due to the because due to this transaction, or is that just normal business procedures? If they sell the current ML&P offices, well, there's a cleaning crew and so on, they don't need anymore. I mean, to me, that's just business changes, not due to this transaction, but others might see it differently.
And through the chair, you are correct that we have cleaning crews in our facilities. They are not ML&P employees or Chugach employees, they are contractors. And if they are generally on an annual basis, year-to-year basis, and so at the point at which the offices didn't need to be cleaned, then they would, the contract for that would not be necessary. As to your question related to Plant 1, there are units at Plant 1 that we do not run, but there are units that we do utilize. We don't use units 1 and 2, but we use units 3 and 4. We have what I would characterize as a skeleton crew that operates those units for us, and they can either be there or they can be utilized in some other capacity at one of the other plants.
Is it all, sir? Mr. Constant?
Yeah, I think that your point, John, Mr. Welton, was that as the result of the sale, it's a pretty squishy term, and that it could allow a number of procedures to occur over time, short or long, that you could easily say, well, this wasn't because of the transaction, this was because of force X or factor Y. And so it's a good replacement, and it's definitely lawyerly language, and it softens the approach, but it's still pretty loose.
Thank you. Mr. Gates?
Thank you. I understand this is our first step, this charter amendment for this transaction to take place. This simply has an ordinance they would pass before the end of the year. Is it possible, Ms. Pearson, that through the ordinance, they simply could define terms like as a result of this transaction, more specifically in the ordinance for me, sorry?
I just make sure I have your question right, that we, is it possible for this, this ballot proposition to define the terms of the sale?
No, rules like this one distinguish being laid off as a result of the transaction. So what that means can be more specifically explained in
Certainly, yes, I apologize.
the ordinance later on.
Certainly, I think I misheard, but certainly this is the first step in a process. The eventual sale would need to be approved by assembly ordinance. So at this point, we're sending the broad brushstrokes to the voters and saying these are the broad brushstroke terms that we would propose guide the transaction. We can't do anything that falls outside of the confines of this ballot proposition. And then this body is then charged in passing an ordinance that approves the final sale and would have an opportunity at that point to weigh in. There's a number of different mechanisms that might address, and there will be pages and pages of terms that address the specifics of each of these provisions in a final purchase agreement for a transaction this complicated. The goal here is to allow the voters to weigh in on some big, broad brushstroke items that are must-haves in any transaction. I think I might get to some questions too if I plow through a little
Please
bit more.
continue, Becky. That's all the question I have for assembly members right now.
Certainly. So then, this is the specific language that will go to the voters. Again, we're creating a new section 16.04, a new option that doesn't exist right now in the charter. It specifies the sale is directed to Chugach Electric Inc. Provides for the time-limited period in which a transaction will be approved. And it again has these provisions here that direct the proceeds, specify that a portion is treated as a payment in lieu of taxes in order to preserve that funding under the cap and make sure other taxes don't rise as a result. So what enabling law allows for something like this to go to the voters for voters to weigh in on a change, a new option, an entirely new provision of the charter. This is provided by both the Alaska Constitution and by Article 18 of our own charter. Article 10, Section 9 of the Constitution states qualified voters may amend their charter via a vote of the majority of those voting on the specific question. Our Section 18.01 again states that the charter may be amended upon concurrence of majority voters. I know there are some questions about this specific section, Section 18.01 that this body has sent on, and I'll get to those in a moment. If we could hold those until later in the presentation. I have some materials that might help with that question. So now I wanted to take an opportunity to walk through the S version page by page to make sure that it's clear what the changes are that are in the S version. A lot of them are simply for clarity because we acknowledge that we're sending a very complicated transaction to voters who have varying levels of experience with this type of transaction. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to make sure that the language was clear as possible, and a lot of the changes are specifically in that category. So on page 1, the first changes are effectively, some of these things I understand are a term of art in the financial services industry, so some of these first changes are in response to feedback from our financial advisors. The changes starting on line 29 are again simply to clarify the language and make clear the goals of the transaction, the reasons that this is in the public interest. This is all, I don't have this on the presentation, so you have to follow along in the paper copy in front of you. Certainly, I apologize. On page 2, the changes starting at line 18 are with respect to the sunset provision of the of this approval, again, limiting the approval to a transaction that's approved sometime before December 31st, 2018, making clear that this isn't front wash due to this transaction at any time in the future. Starting on line 25, we have the changes to the purchase price and allocation of proceeds. These are not substantive, they're not intended to be substantive changes to the original version. They're simply changes to hopefully make more clear how the proceeds will be used. This payment in lieu of tax, municipal utility service assessment portion is a little bit nuanced, and so we wanted to make it as clear as possible how that portion of the proceeds will be used. Added the language starting at line 45 also to make clear that any change in use of the proceeds requires further voter approval. There is no discretionary authority to change this allocated this allocation of the proceeds. Starting at line 49, this is the revised version of the retention of employees section, which includes the commitment not to lay off any MLNP or Gas Electric employees as a result of the transaction. The deletion on page 3, starting at line 6, is again not substantive. That language is now included in the revised language above on page 2. And starting on line 13, again, this is the revised language which specifies that the commitment not to increase base rates applies both to existing MLNP and existing Gas Electric ratepayers as a result of the transaction. The change on line 28 of page 3, again, is just specifying that the charter amendment has a time limitation for this transaction. And that is all the changes to the S version specifically. So then moving on to questions, I wanted to first speak to known questions that we've received already. Again, some of them we've received repeatedly from multiple members of this body or from constituents who contacted multiple members of this body, so I wanted to speak to those first at this point. The first question being, how does this charter change comport with Charter Section 18.01? And I think it does comport with 1801. 1801 says that 1602 can't be changed or diminished by anything other than a 3/5 vote. In this instance, we are not doing anything to 16.02. That option remains. You are fully capable of selling the utility pursuant to Section 16.02 in accordance with the terms set out therein. Again, this simply creates another option to send more specific terms to the voters and allow them to weigh in on a specific transaction rather than simply the yay or nay question. Again, I think the language of the Constitution, Article 10, Section 9 is important. Under the Constitution, the people of any city or borough must be able to amend their charter, any portion of it, including supermajority provisions, by a majority vote. That is a right that underlies and supersedes anything that we might provide for by charter or code on our own. And so a few examples of recent changes to supermajority provisions or alternate paths that have been provided by have gone to the voters by 50+1 vote. In 2015, the new marijuana tax was created by a 50+1 vote, which amended the charter in this way. It amended the 3/5 provision of 1401. In 2005, the bed tax that was similarly sent to voters for approval, and it created an amendment to the charter there in 1401. Second question, it was a specific question, I think Mr. Dyson came from you, regarding the transfer of the Beluga River unit interest and whether or not it could be conveyed to you. Actually asked Dean Thompson to come and talk with us, specifically as outside counsel to MLNP and regulatory issues, to come and answer that question specifically. I apologize for sticking your picture up.
Yes, the short answer to the question is that there is nothing that precludes MLNP from conveying its BRU interest to Chugach. When MLNP first acquired an interest in the BRU, the Regulatory Commission of Alaska approval put a condition on it that the ultimate beneficiaries of any savings would be MLNP's current and future customers. And so from a regulatory perspective, I think as part of the RCA review process, there may be some rate-making treatments that need to be executed in order to comply with that ultimate beneficiary's requirement, but it is not a preclusion on its ability to be conveyed.
Mr. Dyson, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, I did raise this question because my understanding was that back in the day, maybe it was you who rendered this opinion that ML&P couldn't divest themselves of the river unit.
I don't recall coming to that opinion. I do recall that I identified the regulatory issue of rate making would have to be something that would have to be dealt with in order for a conveyance to be approved.
If I may continue, so
Sure.
I'm sure you got it right and I got it wrong, but as I understood it, the legal opinion was that the field really belonged to the ML&P member ratepayers, and they had agreed to a rate increase and so on, and in order to finance that. And so that was the reason that ML&P operating as through the city as the owner couldn't sell it without the agreement of the ratepayers. But I'm sure that we're talking about the same issue, and you're right and I'm wrong.
Yes, I don't recall that ratepayer approval would be required, but I think we're talking about the same thing. And I went and checked my notes from, this is back in 2008, I believe. And like I say, I was identifying an issue that would be implicated or in the RCA's review of a transfer of the DRU.
Yes.
That the RCA would, not because ratepayers had a property interest that needed to be accounted for, but that there was a rate-making treatment that was
Okay. Right.
ordered that would.
Yeah, so then would it be appropriate for us to petition the RCA to bless this effort? In other words, to say that there are no regulatory impediments to going forward?
I don't, standing here, I don't think that would be necessary. I think that Chugach and ML&P will want to address this issue when they seek RCA approval to transfer the certificate of public convenience and necessity as part of the overall approval for the transaction.
And that's post-sale?
To the
Go ahead,
chair,
Chair.
Mr. Dyson, we have had conversations with Chugach on this particular item, and we believe that we have come to an agreement so that the benefit of the ratepayers will stay with the ML&P ratepayers, and as such, we have addressed the concerns related to selling the field, and that will be something that will be part of any petition that goes to the RCA, and as such, we believe that it will be addressed and they won't have an issue with it.
All right, so last comment. Well, first of all, encourage everybody to quit using abbreviations in these things. Most of us don't speak an acronym law. My concern is that we go forward with this and the RCA only having given you an informal thing says, wait a minute, that won't work. On further consideration, that won't work. But that would be before the formal sale.
Right, and I believe that is why we have worked closely with Chugach to address that issue on the benefits related to BRU, and that they stay with the ML&P customers so that it won't ever come up as an issue before the RCA.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Croft, sir.
Yeah, almost similar. So we can sell the unit, but the proceeds, the benefits have to benefit ML&P ratepayers. And so there'll be a structure where there'll be a different rate that ML&P is paying than Chugach area-wide that reflects that sale price and proceeds.
Through the chair, what will happen is the gas transfer price, which we calculate today and change once a year, is how we charge the customers for the value of the gas that comes out of the field. And it will create potentially a different COPA mechanism, the cost of power adjustment, that flows that cost through to what I will term ML&P legacy customers versus Chugach legacy customers.
Well, they'll get a different or better rate because of that investment, because of the proceeds.
Yes.
For some period of time.
And there is gonna be RCA approval. You just wrap all of those terms into one big RCA approval.
That is our intent, and that is why we have worked diligently with Chugach to come to terms that will address that issue and it won't be a stumbling block to RCA approval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Peterson, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so what will happen is the ML&P, current ML&P customers will get a different gas adjustment on their monthly statement than the Chugach Electric current customers, and that will continue until, is it 26 or 2034 or something like that?
The field is through the chair, the field is currently estimated to stop being economic to produce at 2033. We believe, based on the way that we are producing it, it possibly goes beyond that. But the agreement would be, and it's still being negotiated, that at a point in time in the future, that benefit would stop flowing through exclusively to the ML&P customers. And currently, we have kind of pegged that number at 2033 because that's what the estimate of the end of the economic useful life of the field is.
Okay, great, thank you.
Other questions from assembly members? Becky, to continue, ma'am?
Certainly. Other than I have a list of additional questions that have come to us from various sources, some of which I will answer, some of which I'll defer to Mark to answer, some of which I might defer to Chugach to answer. And we just wanted to make sure to get through these today since they did come to our attention before today's work session. First question, what kind of protection will be given to Chugach employees? This question, I believe, came up in response to the original version of the ordinance, which simply specified that ML&P employees would be retained. As we've already discussed, that language has been changed for the agreement of Chugach to include, to apply equally to both Chugach and ML&P employees. Similar response to question number 2, which I think was raised in response to the original version, which spoke simply to base rates for ML&P ratepayers. Again, if you look at the revised version of that language in the S version, the same commitment applies to both Chugach and ML&P ratepayers. I think question number 3 is a question that representatives from Chugach may field more aptly than anyone from the municipal team, but the question of can Chugach incur debt in acquiring ML&P and still potentially lower rates for utility customers?
Yes, my name is Arthur Miller. I'm Executive Manager of Regulatory and External Affairs at Chugach. And the answer to number 3 is yes, absolutely. And that really goes back to the overall capital structure and required return levels, and recognizing the difference between a municipal electric utility and how they set rates and an electric cooperative, how they set rates. And that differential has different return requirements between those 2 different types of electric utilities. And that in and of itself, with the cost of, including the cost of defeasing the existing debt and the structure of this transaction, allows for that, especially on a long-term basis.
Thank you. Are there any questions on that?
Mr. Chairman, I ask a quick follow-up
Yes,
on
Mr.
that.
Dunbar, go ahead.
Is number 3 assisted by the fact that interests right now are fairly low, and if we were to wait, interest rates would to rise, would that change this calculation such that this would no longer be the case?
That can very much have a significant impact in the interest rate environment, absolutely. The capital structure itself, when I talk about that, specifically looking at the return on equity requirements between the organizations, that would not change. But the interest rate is another component of that, absolutely. And what you're saying, yes, that could have an impact on the results.
Let me ask a follow-up to that. So you
Sorry,
do
sir.
some financial work on this, I assume. Does Chugach expect interest rates to continue to rise if we were to delay this transaction?
I think that the overall market seems to indicate that interest rates on a national level are going upwards. We don't know for sure how much they're going to be going upwards over the next year and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Okay, got it.
Mr. Wilson, sir.
So maybe to paraphrase, so you're just saying you can get a longer term loan than MLMP, so you'll spread the payments out over a longer time. Is that what you said?
No.
Oh, correct me then, sorry, that's what I got, so.
I might be able to put this in even more kindergarten level understanding, which is that because of the way, because the organization of a member-owned cooperative versus what MLP is, member-owned cooperatives make less profit than we do. So that's the difference in the equity score that Arthur is talking about. And to make this even more intuitive, I think some people look at this and say, where could you guys come up with $1 billion and then not actually raise rates? To make that slightly more intuitive, how that could happen is they would be acquiring an MLP who's already capable of carrying the $540-ish million in debt. So that is more or less just a transfer. There's some costs associated with that, but they pulled that because they've got the entity that's already got the wherewithal to pay for that. Some of the purchase price is spread out into the future because we have said we will let you pay us slowly over time. And then that really reduces the amount of money they're going to need to borrow immediately pretty significantly at this time when interest rates are pretty low. So I think that's the beginning of how a kindergarten level understanding gets formed as an answer to this question.
Mr. Wilson, anything else, sir?
No, I grasped that one.
I went to a tough kindergarten.
Mr. Constance.
So just to follow up on the point of the interest rates, we are really at a time of near record low historic interest rates. And even if there's a slight increase or marginal increase over the next year, that is an argument for proceeding with due diligence because time is of the essence. Because if things follow the trend, then next year and then the next year and the next year will probably be much more expensive.
Anything, other questions? Becky, on the closure of the BRU, will that cost be shifted then to Chugach Electric if they end up buying MLNP?
I think
Because eventually there's a cost closure. I want to know who's picking that up, or is the city still stuck with that?
Mr. Chair, we MLMP currently have a mechanism in place to collect the cost to fund the closure for the 57% that we own. Chugach has a similar provision to collect the cost for the 10% of the field that they own. Going forward, the customer wouldn't see any difference. They would still be collecting that cost. It's just which customers they collected the cost from. The money would go into the asset retirement obligation fund, and that's what would fund the closure of the field. So the money that we currently have as MLMP, and there's a board that the assembly approved to manage it, would move over to the new owner, and they would have that same fund. They would just add the money to collected from ratepayers to that fund to be able to pay for the retirement of the field at some point in the future.
Thank you, sir.
On to question number 4. Why is this a better path than MLMP buying Chugach? Why would the reverse transaction not be something we would pursue? And I think for this, I'll defer to Mr. Johnson, potentially to Mr. Falsey to weigh in on this.
And I think, as you recall, the resolution that you initially passed talked about a merger. What we found in looking at this is because of the structures of the two utilities, a municipal and a co-op, a merger wasn't really possible, that it required an acquisition. In looking at making an acquisition, could MLMP have bought Chugach? We could have attempted to, but the bylaws of the co-op make it very difficult for someone outside of another co-op to acquire the co-op like Chugach Electric. So that, well, I won't say that it's impossible, it would be virtually impossible because of the numbers of the Chugach voters, members that would have to come in and vote to be able for MLMP to purchase Chugach. It's much easier for Chugach to buy MLMP because it requires their board to vote to put forward the effort to do it, and they have done so.
Okay, Mr. Trade, can I ask a follow-up to
Mr.
that?
Dunbar, sir.
So aside from the sort of logistical challenges of that kind of election or political challenges, are there any economic reasons why it makes more sense to go in the direction we're going?
Well, in the past, there have been studies that were done, and some of them came to the conclusion that it made more sense for ML&P to buy Chugach. Those studies were done in a period of time where there were a lot of different factors than there are today. One of those, we've talked about the interest rate, and the spread between taxable and tax-exempt financing used to be significantly greater than it is today. And that was one of the reasons why it made more sense at the time for ML&P to buy. They also looked at a landscape with generation that is significantly different than the landscape today. We have more efficient generation in the form of SPP and 2A, and SPP being jointly owned. So I think that the landscape is significantly different than it was 10 years ago when this was looked at. Could you look at this and say, if you could get past all of the political stuff, would it make sense? The answer is maybe, but the differential would not be that great. We have not done another study to determine that, but we believe the differential would not be that great because the primary driver was the financing cost, and the difference between the financing costs today and what they were 10 years ago is significant.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Please continue, ma'am.
Certainly. Final question we received in advance. Would it be a better option for ML&P to simply transfer its 30% interest in the South Central Power Plant? I apologize, that's not power plant. And again, I think I'll defer to Mr. Johnson for an answer.
And this is something that, as the Assembly directed us to start looking at this in ways that we could work more closely together, we did, and this was not working with Chugach, but we did look at the possibility of ML&P selling the 30% interest in the South Central Power Plant to either Chugach or some other entity. And what would that do? Because there was a possibility, as you know, the dividend was restricted because of our equity. And it would make a difference in the equity of ML&P and potentially make it easier to get the dividend back, but it didn't move the needle much from where it is now to where it would be. So we determined that selling this didn't necessarily meet all of the requirements. I don't think it would meet the requirements of Chugach on some of the reasons that they are interested in acquiring it. And for ML&P, it would have reduced our debt by about $110 million, but it doesn't necessarily change the situation of the utility going forward.
Good, ma'am.
And that is the last advanced question that we had in the queue. So at this point, I wanted to take any feedback from this body on the ESPERS and any questions that I might be able to respond to on the ordinance or on the transaction.
Mr. Dyson, sir.
Yeah, thank you. So when it says no layoff of Chugach employees, does that mean represented employees or the whole organization?
Through the chair, Mr. Dyson, we have talked with Chugach about this all along, and when the original version of the ordinance was written, we put in just ML&P employees. I believe, and I'll let Chugach respond to it, but I believe that their intent has always been that there would be no layoff of ML&P or Chugach employees, and that's all employees, executive, non-rep, and representative. But I'll let Mr. Miller or Mr. Rissy address that.
No, that is correct. There's no distinction between represented and non-represented employees.
Mr. Dyson?
So just to follow up, that's a grand strategy in order to make sure that Chugach employees don't fight against this, and I understand that. There'll be another group of voters out there who'll say, wait a minute, we're going to do this and we're not going to be able to take advantage of the consolidation of a whole bunch of stuff, and they'll say, but it's a judgment call, and I'm not going to quarrel with it. Probably wouldn't have made the same one, but I understand the political motivation to keep Chugach employees particularly on board with going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
And if I may, Mr. Chair,
Good, sir.
Obviously there is some political consideration related to it, but if you look at the attrition rates for both utilities, both Chugach and ML&P, they're between 4% and 5%. We had 16 retirements last year. I'm assuming that Chugach had a similar number of retirees. By putting the two utilities together, it provides us the ability to leverage the resources that we have between the two. Now, does that mean that you're gonna need every employee?
I got it.
Possibly not.
I got it, thank you.
Mr. Wilton, sir.
You know, under the current charter 1602, if we sold ML&P, the funds that was prioritized, you go pay off debt, city debt, okay? And we've chosen, so we could still do that, but we've chosen instead to put it in the trust fund. And did you compare the two?
No, so certainly, and I apologize if that was unclear. Basically, what we have done, the only change that the ballot proposition would affect to that structure contemplated by 13011 is that it carves out the first piece to replace that use of the payment in lieu of tax. Otherwise, the water bill is actually the same. And it says that at the end of that, let me go back to my ballot proposition language so you can see it. Basically says that, there we go. The disposition of proceeds says basically that there's a portion will be deemed as payment of lieu of taxes for the purposes of section 1403A1, that's the tax cap language. And then all other proceeds will be disposed of in accordance with 1311. And so then we go back to that 1311 waterfall, which says first it goes to pay down ML&P debt, then at the discretion of the assembly can be used to pay down other municipal debt. Third piece, the remainder of it goes into the trust fund and spins off dividends from that established trust. Yeah.
Okay, but the ballot proposition it talks more about money we put in the trust fund. It doesn't talk about paying off other municipal debt, does it?
The ballot proposition just sets out the same language. So if you go to the ballot proposition language, it says 1, retire ML&P and municipality bankerage debt. 2, replace the current payment in lieu of tax. And then 3, fund this might be where the problem went. I had to delete this language in the middle there, so the rest of it is fund the MOA trust fund, the MOA trust fund being that permanent protected fund with dividends payable in accordance with the code.
Well, I understand, but if you go under the current, it doesn't say fund the trust, but I guess it does, but it says pay off other municipal debt.
If you go
So
under
we
the
could get all
current-
this money, we could pay off a bunch of our outstanding debt and not put any in the trust fund. So you kind of can do either of those.
Certainly, 1311 does provide that you can pay off other outstanding debt, and then so this is not a change from 1311. 1311 provides this already. Any sale of a utility, you can use the proceeds to pay off the utilities debt, and then any other debt of the municipality before the residual goes into the trust fund.
So if we paid off to preserve that option in the leverage of number 1, our MLP and MOA.
So we could
Mr.
do
Wilton,
either
to
one.
continue.
So we could take once we pay off that $500.
Speak up, please.
Yeah. Sorry, once we pay off the $500 million roughly in debt, we have some left over annual payments. That could go paying off our current debt. We save some money then.
Certainly.
Or it could go in the trust fund and we spin off some money that we can use to run government. Which one makes us the most money?
That is not a question for me, but I'll defer to
First
some
grade, right?
folks with our
First grade.
financial knowledge on whether which one we think makes us more money. Legally, I had to say that certainly you have the option to do either one.
Yeah, that's gonna depend on a bunch of spreadsheets that Ross Ridgewald and Robert Harris are gonna have to come up with, show so the interest rate on our outstanding debt is versus the amount of money we project the trust fund can return. And I don't know those numbers top of mind.
Thanks.
Is that all, sir?
Yes, thank you.
Mr. Dunbar, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mark, I have two follow-up questions related to what you just said about retirement. So you said between 4 and 5% of your employees are retiring per year. Is that right?
No, what I said is between 4 and 5% of our employees and Chugach employees are attrition. So that attrition could be through retirement, but it could also be through people just leaving.
Okay.
And then our ability to fill those positions may or may not be there because we do have positions that have been open for some time.
So the question then is the same. My question is the same. That 4 to 5% attrition. What's the breakdown within that between represented and non-represented employees?
I would say that it probably is a larger percentage of represented, only because for ML&P, we have, give or take, 230, 240 employees, and 85% of those employees are represented. And so if it was, a number 5% of that, so 12 people, you more likely that some of those would come, more of them would come from the represented than the non-represented.
Then kind of a follow-up question to that, Mr. Chairman, thank you. So you project 4 to 5% attrition, and Chugach has similar numbers. Are you saying that every year going forward after this potential purchase, those positions actually would go unfilled, or there'd be 4 to 5% attrition, and some of those would be filled and some of those would be unfilled?
Well, I think that any utility is going to need certain positions. We'll use linemen as an example. If you had 4 or 5% attrition, and every one of those attrition positions were linemen, you're gonna have to fill them because you have to have linemen.
Right.
And so it's possible that you have attrition and you still refill the position even though you're trying to overall reduce staff, because as I've been talking with the employees, I have said, you can't, if you have too many finance people and a lineman leaves, you can't move a person from finance and make them a lineman.
Sure. So
you have to fill the positions that you need to continue operations.
So I guess if someone from Chugach could speak a little more to that, to someone here, do you have any estimates of Chugach? Yeah, thank you. So if you have any estimate of, we think we're going to get 4 to 5% attrition every year, what actual attrition will we have? Right, because some of those people will be replaced and some won't.
I can speak to that. I'm Brian Hickey, through the chair. We're looking at, currently we're developing a post-acquisition integration plan, so we actually don't have those numbers at this point in time.
Okay.
But we do see overall that we see this 4 to 5% reduction, and we believe that over a period of several years, we can actually move to a right-sized organization. We have the same problem MLP has had, where we've been unable to attract employees that are qualified to fill the positions, and so I think there's a lot of synergy in that particular area. But we don't actually have that number right now, but we are working on a post-integration acquisition plan to give us that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Mr. Croft, sir.
I guess just following up on that, so in some categories you both have difficulty hiring, and in some categories you compete against each other in hiring.
That's correct.
So it's one of the ways that this attrition works out is you move the people around that you both have been searching for.
That's correct. And industry-wide throughout the U.S., there's a hiring problem that's kind of came into being in about 2003, 2005, industry-wide in the electric utility industry. So our ability to attract people from outside, which we did for many, many years, has really diminished. And so we have people there who are qualified, and we have people that we need over here, and we think that there's a lot of synergy in moving those people and getting them in the right spots.
Thanks.
And Mr. Croft, I think that one of the challenges too, and Mr. Hickey addressed this, is that we have difficulty attracting people from out of state because the rates for trades in other areas of the country have come up. So where we may have before been something that you come here because it paid a lot more, that's not necessarily the case anymore.
Other questions for Assembly members? To Maggie, any question from you, sir?
I just have one question on page 3 of 4. On the S portion, on line 3, rights and obligations of the collective bargaining agreement. What would be the results if we slipped in the word current?
I'm sorry, I didn't, which word were you trying to slip in?
The word current collective bargaining agreement.
Well, and I will speak to it and then let Chugach speak to it. The current agreement that we have, they take the transaction when it closes, they take the ML&P agreement as is for our employees. Now, I know that the IBEW is working with Chugach to try and figure out the path forward, but our agreement ends in December 31 of 2019. So if the transaction closes anytime prior to that, the agreement goes with it. They own that agreement.
And so that expires in 2019.
Yes, it does.
So that having the word current in there would be fine.
Legally, I see no problem with it. I'd want to run it by our council just to make sure, but our labor for council just for a double check, but I don't see any reason why that. I mean, that's the intent of the language, is to say that the current collective bargaining agreement, which by its terms would pass to any predecessor, will in fact pass to the predecessor, or the successor, I apologize, successor in interest to the agreement. So I would see no issue at this point with that conclusion legally.
Mr. Constant, sir.
I would just ask Mr. Gray, what's the intent behind the addition of the language
Well, the intent is to be a lot more, definitive and clarify, the bargaining agreement.
Any other questions from Assembly members? Lisa France, anything from you, ma'am? I think you're on the line still.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a side question in regards to when we might be able to release more information that's under non-disclosure to the public.
At this point, all of the existing non-disclosure agreements remain in place, and they're all new information that we've been able to share, we have shared. So discussions continue on it. At this point, everything that is public has been shared.
Do you hear her, ma'am?
Yes, thank you.
Can I follow up on that? Just
Mr. Croft.
And so, as this progresses, there's going to be people asking us questions. So, at one point, you had talked about trying to get at least approval for a summarized version of describing any possible other participants. Is that you're still trying to get
We're
that
still working
permission?
on that.
Okay.
Any questions or comments from Assembly members?
Yeah, just.
Mr. Constant.
Yeah, on that same note then, are we closer to having a summary of the financial analysis provided by the brokers out of New York?
We are continuing to work on that as well.
Thank you.
Now to the administration, you guys need to have another work session before the meeting on the 23rd, or is this the last work session you want to have on this before we go to the full public hearing on the 23rd? Mr. Mayor?
We are at your disposal. If the Assembly feels that more work is necessary, we're happy to do that.
For the body, let me know because I can call a work session immediately if we need one. Mr. Whittle?
I guess, I thought we had one next.
It already scheduled. Yeah.
We may have one next Friday, but just want to make sure we're
Already
there.
scheduled.
So following up on that, so can we have a high-priced financial analyst company look at this now that would be, say, it's going to be public knowledge?
Engage a new financial company to examine the transaction. I mean, I see no legal reason you couldn't. I mean, I think it would be a question of expenditure of resources. How much money would that cost, and how much would this body want to spend to have a second analysis completed?
How much are we talking?
I will defer to more financial.
I would say that it's
information
probably
on-
somewhere between $50,000 and $250,000.
And how quick?
The more money, the quicker that they'll.
Thank you.
Mr. Constant.
Yep, so thank you. On the same note, when I first started this job, the previous Assembly Council cautioned me, always ask for a deadline. And I'm curious when we might have something about the fiscal analysis that we will be able to share with the public, because this is a piece of information that people are very curious about, and just to continue to say it will come, makes it more difficult to advocate or take a stand. So a time specific would be great, even if it's general, not exact. Any ideas?
Understood. I think our initial goal has been as part of this process, and we continue to work diligently to try and chart a path forward on that front.
You know, some Assembly members. If not, this first session is over with. Thanks for being here today.